first before the Roman people, and he will have wanted, quote, to show off his mastery of his art. But when it comes to perhaps his best speech, the Pro Milone, Cicero subjugates form to function, omitting a partitio and also a reprehensio, doubtless because he needed to ignore the damning evidence against his client. And as with the speeches of Aeschines and Antiphon I mentioned earlier, Cicero inserts an extra passage of argumentation between the exordium and the narratio. And this kind of praemunitio, as it was called in Latin by Julius Ruffinianus, also appears in another of Cicero's most famous speeches, the Pro Caelio, where once again the odds seem stacked against his client. The Pro Caelio, as Berry and Erskine divide it, has between the exordium and conclusio no narratio or partitio, but a two-part argumentation, with a praemunitio 3-50 and an argumentatio 51-69. On the other hand, the argumentation of the speech is divided by its recent green and yellow commentator Andrew Dick. Is it Dick or Dyke? Dyke. Andrew Dyke. Into exordium, a first section on Caelius' life and character, 3 sets of refutatio, the first with a second section on Caelius' life and character, and a peroratio. Unfortunately, Dyke, or Dick, seems to have been unable himself to live up to the high moral standards claimed for Caelius by Cicero, but rather to have succumbed to the seductive pleasures of a modern-day bailli called the internet. But his scholarship remains, and Dick comments on the first section of Refutatio. There is no consensus among scholars about how this portion of the speech should be categorized. Austin annexes it to 3-22, labels the whole a praemunitio, whereas Van Wageningen limits his praemunitio to 3-30. Both misuse the term. The division of speeches, it is clear, is no scientific, easily measurable matter. It may be indeed, as my good friend Jaap Visser remarks in his review of Berry and Erskine in Classical Review, that one not uncommon problem with the notion of oratorical form occasionally emerges in the book. Rhetorical theories, particularly the rules for the parts of a speech, are sometimes taken too seriously as principles guiding the composition of ancient speeches. But the rules were nevertheless there for the orator to obey or to ignore. You can count down to the end. 3, style. Lexis, elocutio, is the third part of rhetoric. But Isaios' style was not to everyone's taste. Despite some praise at the start of this passage, which I think is often overlooked, Dionysius of Halicarnassus inevitably compares Isaios unfavorably with Lysias, who, for the ancient critics, was the model of the plain style. But Isaios was important for one thing, if nothing else. It compensates for its lack of Lysianic charm by that brilliant artistic resource, ter ide noterti ters catascues, which makes it the real spring from which the rhetorical power of Demosthenes flows. For Dionysius, Lysias' style has charis, charm, a rather vague concept that it's hard to define, but better to feel intuitively, rather like Plato's forms. But Isaios' style has one great virtue, the strength of dinoteres, cleverness. Being thought of as dinos legein, clever at speaking, could be both a good thing and a bad thing. Similarly, possessing the quality of DIONYSIUS, cleverness, could render a speaker suspicious, as Thucydides tells us was the case with Antiphon, while Demosthenes attacks Philip of Macedon for his DIONYSIUS on the Crown 144. But as Usher noted, DIONYSIUS is generally used in the orators to denote eloquence, and in rhetorical criticism it connotes a formidable force or intensity of oratory, the quality that is particularly associated by Dionysius with Demosthenes. But for Dionysius, Isaios too, being Demosthenes' teacher in the tradition, possessed that quality. A good example comes right at the end of speech 5 on the estate of Diciogenes, where the speaker indulges in character assassination of his opponent. Note the hypophora at the start. This is when you ask questions and then answer them, which is what Londoners are supposed to do all the time, isn't it? Yes. The sudden apostrophe at the end, in which you do not share at all, Diciogenes. A figure in which you address your opponent directly. In performance, the speaker, Menexenus, must have sneered and pointed at his opponent. You don't share any of this, Diciogenes. But I cannot resist an example of the supreme style of Demosthenes from the start of a speech, the famous opening to the third Philippic, the finest political speech of antiquity. I give you Jeremy Trevet's brave translation of the brilliant single periodic sentence in the Greek, the second half of which might be taken as a prescient commentary on the situation today in Greece. Plus ça change for the beleaguered Athenians. For Aristotle, the virtue of diction, lexeos arete, consists of clarity and appropriateness. His successor, Theophrastus, added correctness of language and ornament. And while these four virtutes dicendi were taken up by Cicero, the De Oratore, and Quintilian, for Quintilian, possession of the virtue of ornament clearly was the most important of the four. But with elegance and ornament, the orator is out to recommend himself as well as his cause, and seeks not only, as in all his other activities, the judgment of experts, but also the praise of the general public. He is fighting with weapons that are not only effective, but polished and gleaming. Metaphor, of course, like the one with which Quintilian ends this passage, is essential. As for appropriateness, diction will vary according to the purposes of the speech. And so, alongside the virtues, develop the theory of the three styles of speaking, genera dicendi, of plain, middle, and grand. This was again the work of Theophrastus. And while the Athenian orators tended to be classified according to one of these styles, for Cicero, in the Orator, the perfect orator should be a master of all three. And I'll leave it to you to guess who Cicero thought came closest to what he calls that Platonic idea. But here is a clue. Despite his disavowal, to be fair, Cicero did actually have claims to rival Demosthenes, his opening to the Pro Caelio being a case in point. Okay, this is 2 sentences in the Latin, not like the one in the Demosthenes. 3 in Dominic Berry's elegant English translation. I think the Loeb translator Younger did it in 2, but less elegantly, of course. But it's nevertheless a brilliant example of what could be done with that far less flexible language than Greek. We move on to the 4th part of rhetoric. Memory, mneme, or memoria. Once you've discovered the arguments you wish to use, in which order you wish to use them, and how best to present them stylistically, you have to remember them. Both Cicero in the De Oratore and Quintilian attribute the invention of mnemonics to Simonides of Chios in the 5th century, late 5th or early 4th century BC. As Jocelyn Penny Small notes in her chapter on memory and the Roman orator in the Blackwell Companion to Roman Rhetoric, this coincided with the expansion in the numbers of written text. But far from decreasing reliance on memory, she argues, growing literacy actually increased it. There's another mention, early mention of memory in the 5th century BC rhetorical piece Dissoi Logoi, or Contrasting Arguments. But our first extant discussion of memory comes in the Ad Herennium in the 1st century. At 2338, the author writes, "I know that most of the Greeks who have written on the memory have taken the course of listing images that correspond to a great many words." In other words, how it is still done today. But it's entirely unclear who these Greeks were. Aristotle, for instance, does not discuss memory in the Rhetoric. There's an interesting scene in Plato's Phaedrus, as Socrates persuades Phaedrus to read out, and he does read out, not recite from memory, a speech on the theme of love allegedly composed by Lysias. Phaedrus admits that he has not learned the speech by heart, and indeed asks Socrates, "Do you think that I, an amateur, idioten, will be able to repeat from memory?" Idiotes, now the English word idiot, strictly means, of course, a private citizen. But Phaedrus, as an interlocutor of Socrates, was no ordinary private Athenian. And his words presumably might be applied to many of Lysias' clients, as well as to the many ordinary litigants who were the clients of the Attic logographers, both those who survive and many others. Memory, in fact, probably did not become part of rhetorical theory until as late as the 2nd century BC. Having earlier noted doubts over the importance of